This is the On Humans podcast with your host, Ilari Mäkelä. How should we raise our children? And this is, of course, one of the biggest questions in life. It's a very personal question for people who have children. And it is a question that shapes the start that each generation in our society gains to their life. Now, there is no shortage of parenting guides out there, many of them undoubtedly very useful. But I do sometimes worry that we might have a problem in putting so much emphasis on parenting when talking about child rearing. After all, parents are already feeling a lot of stress, a lot of pressure, feelings of exhaustion, amplified sometimes by feelings of guilt and inadequacy. And the wonderful joy that so many people do report after having children too often does also turn into postpartum depression. Indeed, parenting is hard, but it does raise a question, why? Is this an inevitable part of the human condition? Or is there something wrong in our society? How would we even know the answer? Now, to start approaching these difficult questions, anthropologists have started comparing family lives in industrial societies with those of the last remaining hunter-gatherers, which I just find an incredibly interesting line of research. And my guest today is one such anthropologist. Nikhil Chaudhary is a researcher at the University of Cambridge who works on the relationship between evolution and mental health, and has recently been doing this work on hunter-gatherer childhoods. And while no such a group is exactly alike, there are striking similarities, he says. Now, on the one hand, hunter-gatherers offer an intense amount of very gentle care to their children, really unmatched by what most children receive in our society here in the UK. For example, with the Kung of the Kalahari Desert, a 4-month-old infant is, quote, in physical contact with someone for around 90% of daylight hours, and almost 100% of crying bouts are responded to, almost always with comforting and nursing. Scolding is extremely rare, unquote. But importantly, hunter-gatherers do not expect this intense care to spring solely from the mythical well of maternal instincts. The intense care in hunter-gatherers is enabled by an equally intense amount of social support. Children are constantly cared for by so-called allo-parents, in other words, caregivers other than the biological parents. And just as a contrast to modern nurseries where each caregiver is responsible for several children, a single child in hunter-gatherer group can be matched by 10 or more available adults. So, is this the natural form of human parenting? And if it is, does it create happy families without issues like postpartum depression? Or is that too romantic a picture of hunter-gatherer lifestyle? More generally, what if anything could industrial societies learn from all of this? What can we achieve by politics? What about neighbors and friends? Are nuclear families part of the problem or part of the solution? We touched upon these and many other questions in this conversation. I really enjoyed it, especially because while we focused on learning from hunter-gatherers, I also felt that I just learned much more about this singularly interesting lifestyle, both of its highlights and of its tragedies, in a way gaining a more human face to these people that folks interested in human evolution so often talk about. I hope that you feel something similar too. If you do like this and other conversations here at the On Humans podcast, please show it. Subscribe to the show, leave a review, and share it with a friend. You can also become a paying member at patreon.com/onhumans, and you can get a lot more information and analysis on the newsletter at onhumans.substack.com. But let's get back to the show. I bring to you Nikhil Chaudhary. Dr. Nikhil Chaudhary, welcome to On Humans.
Thanks for having me.
You work with hunter-gatherer people, especially the Bayaka in Congo. Can you give a little bit of a flavor before we get into all the theory, just about the practical life? What is a day like in a hunter-gatherer group?
Sure. They're living in groups of, there's a lot of variation, but let's say around 30 to 60 people where I work, and each live in a hut with something resembling a nuclear family in each hut. But again, lots of variation.
So something like a married couple and their children?
Yeah. A married couple, their children.
Do they have a marriage ceremony? Or?
Not a ceremony. Where I work, it happens quite informally. I guess a couple just starts living together, maybe in their late teens. They'll live in a hut together, and then it's called a fuma. So they'll move into a fuma together, and it just organically.
Okay, so it's a little bit more like dating maybe in the UK rather than like getting married.
Yes, I mean, it's a gradual shift, but of course, unlike dating, I think there's more of a commitment there, especially once children start. I mean, it's just that not an official ceremony. That said, certainly in the past and in some places now, they still practice bride service. So in lots of populations around the world, you see in this bride price. In a pastoralist society, males are going to give a lot of livestock in exchange for wives, whereas in hunter gatherers, or at least immediate return hunter gatherers, and if you're interested, we can go into what.
Yeah, immediate return basically means that they don't have food storage. They live in the kind of very original day to day
So,
hunting and gathering. And
yes, so there is no wealth for the males to give to the wife's family, but they sometimes practice bride service. So the husband, at least traditionally, during the bride service period, they'd spend quite a lot of time with the wife's parents, whichever camp they're in. And the husband would be expected to help out a lot, maybe go honey collecting often or hunting often, and engaging in some productive work for the wife's family. I said, I don't see that much. And I think there's a lot of variation, but that would be one formal landmark of the relationship, you could say.
okay. By the way, now that we are on the marriage and romantic aspect of it, do you see a lot of like lifelong partners? Do you see a lot of like people just change? They have one kid with one, they raise them till they're like uh, more independent, and then they find a new partner. Or how common are also would be things like polygamy, polyandry,
So often immediate return hunter gatherers broadly would be classified as serial monogamous.
which is very much like the dating scene in the UK. By the way, you're monogamous
Exactly.
for a while, but then you find a new one. At some point you break up.
Even when it comes to marriage, I mean, I saw recently that the divorce rate in the UK is something like 40%. And I'd say maybe in the Bayaka, in the communities I work with, it's quite similar to that. I'd say it's not unusual for someone to have two long-term reproductive partnerships over their life course, although I would say the norm is probably one reproductive partnership over the life course. That said, I should mention that across immediate return hunter gatherers, this can vary quite a lot. I think the upper end, you're sort of thinking maybe 3 or 4, whereas the lower end, perhaps like the Bayaka, where the mode is just one. And as for simultaneous reproductive partnerships, so a man having two wives who simultaneously, it is relatively rare. There's a lot more instability when a man has multiple wives simultaneously, so it's more likely one of those relationships would break down, as you might expect.
Can it be more turbulent?
I found that about 10% of men at one point in their life will have two reproductive partners simultaneously. Now, often that breaks down.
What about females?
Females, I haven't seen any polyandry. You get these transitionary phases, but there might be some overlap, I guess, between changing spouses. But with men, you do sometimes have sustained and in some cases, lifelong multiple wives at the same time. They wouldn't all live in the same house. The wives usually live in different camps, and the man will move between them and spend time between them.
Oh, I see. I see. So this is you have two long distance lovers that you
Yeah.
fluctuate between.
Yes, exactly. And amongst hunter gatherers, again, the best predictor, or one of the best predictors of the rate of polygyny worldwide, is the amount of inequality in male wealth. When there's more inequality in male wealth, you get more polygyny. But again, in immediate return hunter gatherers, you've got no storage of wealth. And as that really puts a ceiling on how frequent polygyny can be. And that's why generally you're never going to see really high rates of polygyny in hunter gatherers.
What about kind of more what some people might want to label just polyamory? So, for example, there are these records, I think, from some Amazon basin tribes. I don't know actually if they're hunter gatherers or not, but I think they have belief in shared paternity. So the idea that it's kind of a joint effort to produce a child, and they tend to be just very, pick your word, very liberal, I guess, with with the amount of partners. Is this something that's very much an interesting instance in this one part of the world, but you don't see anything like that really as a norm in hunter-gatherer societies like the Bayaka?
I think those particle paternity beliefs are certainly concentrated in the Amazon. As you say, they've got these really interesting ideas that as soon as a female becomes pregnant, any other male that she has sex with contributes biologically. But yes, I would say most of those groups are forager horticulturalists. So they're hunting and gathering, but they're usually practicing some small scale gardening as well, practicing mixed subsistence. And actually, on that point, this would be an appropriate time to give a caveat all around, which is that contemporary hunter gatherers, a lot has changed over the last decade, a lot has changed over the last few decades. And the point we're at right now, it's very rare to find a contemporary hunter gatherer population which is purely reliant on hunting and gathering. They may engage in some trade or, in some cases, some really small scale gardening. Not that you classify them as horticulturalists, but the idea that 100% of their diet is purely coming from hunting and gathering, that's pretty rare nowadays.
Well, and I think that that's maybe something that we could dig in deeper a little bit later, is this very general debate about whether there's anything about the human past that we can learn by studying modern day hunter-gatherers. Let's put a pin on that and focus first still on, if we assume that there's something that we can learn by seeing some patterns in these immediate return hunter-gatherers, what could we learn? Well, we started seeing, I was actually quite surprised. So far, pretty much everything we've said is remarkably, I think, similar than what you might find in a place like UK, where we are. What is quite different is that while there are these nuclear families, there is this much more social support to the families from the outside, right?
Yeah. I mean, the level of support is just incomparable. I'm at an age now where a lot of my friends are starting to have kids, and they are all exhausted, sleep deprived, drained during the day. That's not to say they're hating it. Of course, there's so many rewards that come with having a child. But I would say that one of the most uniform things I see is the exhaustion. And in where I work, and certainly in hunter-gatherers generally, alloparenting is the norm. And by alloparenting, as you mentioned earlier, it means individuals other than the parents are involved in raising the children. And that's thought to be one of the most fundamental human adaptations. It allowed us to have more children for various reasons.
Yeah, we have longer childhoods, but less gaps between children than chimpanzees, for example.
Yes, yeah. It allowed us to shorten the interbirth interval, and it had all sorts of...
Yeah. Despite increasing the length of childhood, it's a very odd thing that happened, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of strange things in human life history. But I mean, to give some descriptive examples just to convey the level of difference, generally found that even in infancy, around half of care is coming from individuals other than the mother.
How much of that is the father?
So where I'm working, of that, the father's providing about 6 or 7% of the care. So that 50% is, largely other people.
Is it largely other women?
More women than men, but plenty of men are involved as well. It varies across societies. You do see some hunter-gatherer societies where girls and women do a lot more alloparenting than boys and men. It is more in the Bayaka, but it's by no means unusual for boys and men to be involved in looking after the kid.
I like hearing that.
Yeah. And also bear in mind that these kids are actually getting more attention and more hands-on care. So it's not just the relative distribution between mothers and others. And I think one thing that's, of course, very distressing for mothers, and one of the things that can be most likely to lead to psychological dysregulation is colic or very frequent infant crying. So I found that in about 40% of cases, neither parent was involved at all in responding to the infant's cries. And then in about 10% of cases, there would be the mother supported by another mother, someone else. And then in just under 50% of cases, the mother is dealing with the cries alone. That's a really big difference, and would make, just a real profound difference to the experience, I think.
Well, it really does, I guess. Yeah.
It's funny, I mentioned in each hut, there's a nuclear family. Now, bear in mind, a hut is tiny. I'm always fascinated by this. You've got two parents and their four kids all in, a hut, which is, I, you couldn't stand up in it. And you can, it's sort of, imagine standing up and it's probably to your shoulders. And if you were to lie down, it just about lets you stretch your legs. So this is tiny and you've got a whole family staying in there. Um, I've actually done that. For one of my initiations, I had to just stay inside a hut. And apart from going to the toilet, I couldn't leave for 3 days. And I cannot tell you how uncomfortable I found it. But the reason I bring this up, though, is I mentioned you've got something resembling a nuclear family in a hut, but I think perhaps it's more appropriate to think of a hut more like a room in a house rather than a house in and of
I
itself.
see.
So you've got this camp, and then you might have something like, 8 huts, and they're all arranged in something like a circle. And it's just this sort of igloo type shape, let's say, and there's an opening. So they're fully open. Imagine that there's no door, let's say, and they're all facing inwards. And then you've got the central camp area. And one hut is going to be, the next hut along is, only a meter or two along. So it's much more like you've got lots of these nuclear families living together in a house, a big house.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a good image.
And then in that sense, or as you say, yes, they have nuclear families, which is similar to what we have in the UK, but you could think of the residence pattern, even at a given point in time, ignoring the fact that they're mobile, which also changes things up a lot. But at any given point in time, you are living together, in this sort of big house, you could say, with lots of families. And then
That's fascinating.
along with that comes, social isolation, for example. Just, you can't be socially isolated as a hunter gatherer, even if you wanted
Yeah.
to be. It's just not possible.
And by the way, I think that, am I right in saying that this is somehow similar, but not the same as what you might see in these massive extended families that are very valued in, for example, Chinese culture, where the more generations you can have under one roof, the greater the family, because these are not all genetically related people living around the same campfire. This is not a big family. This is something quite different, right?
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing to point out, because for a long time, there was this idea, and as you say, we'll come back to whether contemporary hunter-gatherers are a good analog for understanding the past. But a long time, there was this idea that in over in ancestral populations, we lived in these small groups which are very highly related. But all the data, when you look at contemporary hunter-gatherers, this is one thing, part of the big project I was part of, was looking at the variation in relatedness within hunter-gatherer camps. And actually, you've got really strong similarities across all contemporary hunter-gatherer populations. And what you see is
Okay.
that genetic relatedness, the average genetic relatedness between adults in a camp, is quite low. So, if you've got 30 other adults in a camp, there may be 3 or 4 other adults who I'm closely related to, maybe a few
Yeah.
that my spouse is related to, and quite a lot who I'm not related to. And that's really important,
Yeah.
thinking about the fact that humans are so pro-social and cooperative.
Yeah.
I think it's debatable, but one aspect that people would say is at least quite not unique to, but clearly very prevalent in our species, is how much we cooperate and help people we're not related to. And when we think
Yeah.
about this social structure that's been there in the past, where actually you've got low genetic relatedness, and genetic relatedness often underpins cooperation in the animal kingdom,
Yeah.
always, but often, it set the stage really for humans to have an evolutionary trajectory, behavioral trajectory towards cooperating with non-genetic relatives. That the knock-on effects are huge.
Returning to the point about hunter-gatherers not being alone pretty much ever. It's not, I think what's easy to think about is that it's nice that you don't have to walk into your lonely studio and not have anyone to
Yeah,
call in your old age. On the other hand, I guess there could be issues about people wanting privacy. You know, kids often want their own room rather than sharing it with their siblings, etc., etc. Uh, do you see, and I know that you're not living inside the mind of every person that you live with when you're living with the Bayaka, but do you see a lot of any need for privacy that gets unfulfilled? Is there a kind of other side to this extreme sociality?
yeah. When I think about it, there are some people who are clearly a bit more at what we very crudely call an introvert. You do see introverts there. Privacy, that's an interesting thing. And I haven't really thought about it in depth. I certainly haven't asked about it. I can certainly say from my experience, coming from a context where I can have privacy, I certainly struggle with that at points. I get used to it. And perhaps the fact that I acclimatize to it quite quickly, maybe that tells us something about if you're constantly in that context, and it may be one of those cases of if you've never had it, you're not going to crave it.
Yeah. I mean, there is the question of whether our desire for privacy is something which, I mean, the Buddha said about anger that it has a honeyed tip and a poisoned root. I wonder whether our desire for extreme privacy could sometimes be one which has a honeyed tip and a poisoned root, in that it feels fun at first, just like a lot of things feel fun. I mean, smoking cigarettes could be an analogy, actually, and not a bad analogy, because there is evidence that loneliness is just as bad for health as smoking quite a lot of cigarettes, right? So yeah, I think I'm not expecting you to have a scientific answer to this, but I guess the interesting question is whether this is they like this kind of lifestyle, we like that kind of lifestyle, or whether there could even be something that maybe there is a kind of initial desire for privacy that people tend to go for, but it is a very dangerous path. It has a poisoned root because it can so easily lead to loneliness.
Yeah, I think like everything, it's a balance. Certainly privacy in and of itself isn't going to be damaging. They're two things I'd say on that. One is once you get a snowball effect and you've got certain people who are being isolated and really lacking in the amount of social interaction they're having, then perhaps it's more likely to be problematic. And the other is you mentioned those studies, which I've always found so shocking, but they've been replicated so many times and the meta-analyses are quite conclusive that at least in a sort of high income society, poor social support and one's social world is one of the best predictors of longevity and morbidity risk and physical.
Yeah, it's like sometimes it's the biggest.
Yeah, exactly. It's either smoking or social world, which is going to be the number one in those studies. But when you dissect the social aspect of that, if I remember correctly, the importance of perceived support and perceived friendship and equally functional friendships and kin relations of who can you actually rely on can often have a larger effect than the objective reality of how often you interacting with people. It's about this sense of support and being able to rely on people. So whilst privacy might detract from how frequently you're interacting with people, I wonder whether, of course, that can then be associated with the lack of support, lack of functional support and perceived strength of relationships. I think that might be really the turning point in terms of the effect on mental health. And when you think about a hunter-gatherer context, even if there are these people who, as far as is possible when you're living in a community, try and isolate themselves, this element of support is inherent to hunter-gatherer day to day.
And I think that's important, that it is an element of support, that it's not just that people are living in close community. Because I mean, I did my master's in Peking University, and I was, I think, objectively speaking, rather unfairly housed as the international students are housed. So I had my own room. Can you guess how many PhD students share a room in the top university in China?
2.
8 is the minimum, pretty much.
Wow.
So I haven't had that experience. I don't know, and I hope, and to some extent, I believe that there will be a camaraderie, a certain kind of family mentality around the group of people who live together. But it's also an incredibly competitive environment. I mean,
Yeah.
East Asian education system is not known for a kind of yeah, let's do group work and all support each other.
Yeah.
So leaving aside what exactly the atmosphere is like in a crowded dorm in Peking University, I just think that it's important to notice that it's not necessary
Yeah.
that living without privacy is associated with social support, but it very much is so in this hunter-gatherer context. You're saying there, I mean, just food-wise, people are constantly eating each other's food, right?
Yeah, I think in almost all contemporary hunter-gatherers, if you weren't sharing, it doesn't matter if you're the best hunter, you're going to have a real problem. Widespread food sharing is pretty normative.
You highlight a lot in your writings that parenting is just much, I guess it would be fair to say, easier, because you have constant support from so many other people, so-called allo parents, so not genetically related people around. Could be theorized that it's better for the children. They get constant touch every time they cry. There's really striking evidence in your paper about how close to 90 or 100% of the time when a child cries in hunter-gatherer groups, various hunter-gatherer groups, someone is there consoling them, which is just so much to ask from parents in a nuclear family. And do you know about the continuum concept?
So what, sorry?
The continuum concept. This is something from the 70s, 80s. Not an anthropologist, but someone who got into contact with other hunter-gatherers or some similarly, small-scale industrial societies, where she saw very much kind of what you're describing. I think immediately when the children cry, someone is there for them. And then she kind of popularized this in parenting guides in the West as kind of, this is the natural way to look after children. And leaving completely aside the question of how much better those methods are for children, they put an exceedingly high demand on the mother.
Yeah.
And so the political issues around this, the controversy is that it really asks just mothers to do more and more and more and more, as if like and a lot of mothers say that they feel totally, they are already feeling a lot of guilt. They already feel like they're not doing enough. And here comes these experts who tell that if you're not wanting to give a traumatic experience to your child, actually you're doing all wrong. Of course, the most obvious thing is just a very long period of breastfeeding. But the more general tendency is putting more and more pressure on the mothers. And I think that what's I think interesting here is to notice that even if some aspects of that might be beneficial for children, the message here is not that the mothers should be expected to do more. It's kind of the opposite. It's that we expect already too much of the mothers.
Yeah, we're doing some work with the NHS at the moment.
Oh, really? Okay. For those who are not English listeners and don't know, NHS is the National Health
Service. And in one NHS trust with, which is basically just in a region where, of the country, they're split to trusts with the healthcare, and in the perinatal psychiatry team, what we're going to do, and I don't know how it's going to end up, but we're going to run these focus groups telling mothers who have struggled with these problems of guilt and the sense that they're inadequate or they're struggling to manage and something's wrong with them as mothers. You know, there's often this idea of the maternal instinct, and that if you don't know how to do it, or you're not managing, all right, there's something wrong with you. So we're going to do these focus groups and sort of give them the evolutionary understanding to really combat this narrative of like mothers should be able to do everything. The maternal instinct you should be fine. So we're going to give them the evolutionary context and explain how social support and cooperative child rearing has been normative. There's nothing wrong with struggling to manage, and give them some of these ethnographic examples, and with them try and understand how useful that information is for them in reducing guilt or senses of inadequacy, and to create some information sheets that we can then give to mothers who come in with these symptoms. Because perhaps, I mean, there's a lot of work showing that the guilt and shame of struggling to manage as a mother is having effects that people aren't actually seeking support because they're too ashamed to say that mothers are too ashamed to say that they need it. But if we can somehow communicate even to some mothers that actually there's nothing to be ashamed of, that you can't manage this alone, and it doesn't mean there's something wrong with you or your maternal instinct, perhaps that could both alleviate the guilt and shame and improve help seeking. I mean, the other side to that is, do we have resources for sufficient help seeking?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is the problem also is what to do, because I've been sold for many years, and this was really, I think, one of my early windows to the mesmerizing world of human evolution. Um, was really topics around this, and I think I mean, I told you earlier before we started that my dad is a child psychiatrist and a big fan of Sarah Hardy's work, and I think that when he was working for the Finnish National Institute of Health, he was very, very much focusing on this problem that we kind of expect mothers to be chimpanzee mothers, was the way he often said it. A chimpanzee mother is kind of quote unquote programmed to just take care of the kid, whatever happens, alone. Humans are not. And fathers, the role of fathers is very interesting in heterosexual couples who live in this nuclear family way, because like you said, the fathers don't actually give that much in the bayaka. So maybe it's the role of the fathers or the other people living there to take a lot of this responsibility. Maybe this can be a bit of a call to action.
But just to say, that varies really considerably. Actually, I work specifically with this group called the Benjele, which is a subgroup of Bayaka, and just north in Central African Republic are the Aka, part of this same meta group of the Bayaka, who are thought to be the best fathers in the world. Like, men are within arm's reach distance of their baby for 50%. Okay.
Oh, so they really have an easy time then, because if they have both the allo parenting and the dads and so on all the time. Okay. But yeah, I'm really just fascinated that you're actually working with the NHS and starting to take this away from the world of books, articles, and podcasts into National Health Services. But what should we do? What can we do besides maybe asking fathers or whoever is there with the mother to give more, as much support as they can? What can we do as a society? I mean, my worry is that, like, I like the idea of living, for example, close to the grandparents, having a lot of aunts and uncles around, but that doesn't happen because I want it to happen. Of course, yeah, I can move closer to my parents, but what if my parents are on one side of the world and then my partner's parents are on another side of the world? What if there are other reasons why we're not moving close? I mean, there's just so many ways in which, no matter how deep the understanding is, which does reduce guilt perhaps, but no matter how deep it is, it's just very difficult to. We can't live like the hunter-gatherers easily. So what do you think? What are the lowest hanging fruits, and what is the utopian vision, which is realistic in an industrial society?
I mean, it's so difficult. I think if we think in a formal sense about childcare and childcare support, which is available, if we start, people making budgets and policy, integrating the mental health effects that the structure of childcare can have on mothers and also children, even from a purely, economic perspective. Of course, mental health is such a drain on the NHS. And if we start not just seeing childcare as this purely practical thing that allows mothers to work, but start integrating the money saved in terms of the better health of mothers and offspring, that is, of course, going to change budgets, and that's started to happen. But what's happened just now is, for the first time, I think, ever in the UK budget, which is announced annually, like the big budget, that childcare has been right at the top of in the sort of short list of top priorities, and they effectively are giving more free childcare to mothers, right? But the problem there is it's only for working mothers, right? So again, the drive here is just, oh, well, maybe from a purely economic perspective, this is allowing more women to get back in the labor force and would increase like net productivity. But childcare can't just be about, it's not for women. It shouldn't be about, let's replace mother's labor from looking after a kid to a profession and it being in the labor market. There needs to be some support, which is actually relieving mothers and giving them, time to rest. And really, when we think about childcare support, as you say, we don't have the social fabric in terms of how communities are organized to necessarily recreate this sort of communal childcare. So to some degree, with the current structures we have, it has to come through policy. And that entails, you know, showing the benefits, the broader benefits, even if it is in a clinical economic sense.
Of course, it's not true that we can't do anything. I'm sure that, for example, the question of how close to grandparents or other involved adults I decide to move is a consideration where I think this kind of appreciation can sometimes tweak the decision. But it is still, I just feel like it's just going to be tweaking when people are living all over the world.
I mean, different cultural shifts can happen. And I know in Europe or some parts of Europe, these communal living or, what they call intentional communities, where the way the residence is structured, in some way, there's some analog actually there in that it's not all the families have separate rooms and a communal space. All families have sort of separate flats, but then there are communal spaces like to eat. That's in a communal kitchen and there's communal lounges. It's more like the beds and toilets in the separate flats. And those things, on the one hand, you're talking about tweaking, and that is true. I guess the only real practical way in some way to recreate fundamental social support networks that mothers really need, I think, is quite profound cultural changes. And they're clearly feasible because I don't know whether it's in Germany, during my last existential crisis where I decided I want to live in a more sort of community type setup, I was quite impressed how in certain European countries, the rate at which these intentional communities and more communal type residents have sort of exponentially increased. And then you've got much tighter support networks that can emerge from that. If you are in effect sharing a kitchen or sharing a lounge and living area with other families and other parents, there's much more scope for these sort of cooperative child rearing systems to emerge.
And I guess, honestly, one of the things that we can all do is think if there is someone close to us who might need a helping hand every once in a while. A good friend of mine, her friend, had a child recently, and they are a family of two mothers and a very young now, I think 6-month-old child. And she just called them and asked if they want to do kind of a sleepover thing, but like she can be responsible for the kid for the night and wake up for the crying. And she went and she also did a little bit of cleaning and things like that because it's quite stressful time for the moms. She said that what was really surprising to her was that she was the first one to do it in 6 months. So I think that that's also an easy place to start for us.
Yeah.
If we have friends with kids.
Even family, I mean, I'm so shocked at how many new parents I'm seeing in my sort of social network who don't have familial support. It's not even just about friends. My sister just had a baby for the first time, and we've been so lucky. So she lives 5 minutes away from my mum, 5 minutes away from my dad, and my parents split. So and then her mother-in-law is close by as well, and might be moving closer possibly. So she's so lucky, and I see often new parents or parents with high dependency loads not having even family around. So I think we really are at an extreme of how fragmented our friendships and family are, and that again, cultural shift could really change that.
Returning to the core theme of your research, which is the question of whether the kind of lifestyles that hunter-gatherers live could be much more conducive to mental health and flourishing. So a lot of people could theorize, at least, that, okay, these people are going to be very happy people without the kind of mental health problems that we have. What do you think about that?
I think the most important thing to say first is not to romanticize, as we often do, the hunter-gatherer way of life.
Yes, I certainly do sometimes.
It is I feel relatively confident that when I go out there and focus on looking at this, that there are mental health problems, there are occurrences of what we consider psychiatric disorders. The questions then become about prevalence and also risk factors. So I think we shouldn't imagine that no one has mental health problems in these societies, but there are certain risks which might be strong risk factors here for a mental health problem and not there, and vice versa, right? So to give you an example, there was one of the very few epidemiological studies that's been done, very small sample size, but great that people are starting to do this work. They looked at, in fact, this really illustrates the point well. They looked at postpartum depression rates among the Hadza, so the Tanzanian hunter-gatherers.
Which is fascinating, by the way, because that's one thing that if you would have asked me, my romantic mind and my analytical mind looking just about the fact that they have all this social support, not having social support is a predictor of postpartum depression. They're egalitarian. Economic inequality is, according to some studies, actually the biggest predictor of postpartum depression. So they shouldn't have it.
Yeah.
They should be completely free from it. But now I'm spoiling the story. So yeah, you can finish.
No, that's exactly right. I think you sort of pointed out, and I'd say maybe not the social support. I'd say it's perhaps the most well established in terms of just how many studies consistently find it as a risk factor. And then in this Hadza study, they actually found high postpartum. They only looked at 22 mothers, and I think we do need to do more work and maybe develop the methods a bit more. But they found really high rates. I think so. They used this Edinburgh postnatal depression scale, which has been cross-culturally validated and in rural areas too. The degree to which it's appropriate for hunter-gatherers, I'm not entirely sure yet. I'm sure the authors thought about this a lot, but they found something like 50% of the mothers with infants surpassed the threshold of what we would consider probable depression.
Which is much higher than you would find in the UK.
Yeah.
I think the exact percentages are kind of unnecessary here because, like you said, 22 people, a lot of question marks, but it certainly didn't come out as zero.
Exactly. And this illustrates the point of they looked at social support in some way. And again, it was a small sample, but they found it had no effect, no predictive effect. So that shows that on the one hand, we've been talking about social support a lot, and it's this really important, clear risk factor, and it's seeming to have no predictive effect in the Hadza, which doesn't surprise me.
Because they all seem to have it, yeah.
But then on the other hand, they've got this really high rate, and the authors did some follow-up interviews and concluded this was largely driven by the really high infant mortality risk. So in hunter-gatherers, you're sort of looking about 30 to 50% infant mortality rates across societies. So, and whether we want to pathologize that, I mean, it makes total sense, but it's a great example of the fact that we can still say there's certain aspects of our lifestyle which are sort of anomalous over our evolutionary history, which are causing real problems to our mental health, without having to say, oh, hunter-gatherers don't have mental health problems. It's
Yes, because we have some things which are really remarkably novel and pretty positive, like the fact that we don't lose 30% of our kids. And I think it's easy to think that, oh, well, they must have gotten used to it. Oh, if it happens all the time, it's not such a tragedy. And I think it's just, for me, it was a refreshing moment of recognizing the fact that It doesn't matter how often it happens. It really is a tragedy.
When you think about, just very base level drivers of social emotions, the idea of parental investment in species where you've got parental investment or where offspring are reliant on input from others and are highly reliant, emotional rights, that's going to be such a potent force, this deep sense of protectiveness or love towards your offspring. And, one might argue that in populations where the risk of mortality is really high, then those drives should be even more pronounced because they're functioning, actually keeping the kid alive. I'm just remembering a couple of instances. I went on these trips, which was 4 years apart, and they let me know that this infant who I was quite fond of had died. And then and they asked me, "Oh, do you have a photo? Do you have a photo?" Because I can take photos and I give it to them. And I didn't have a photo of him. And then again, I went 2 years later and they asked me, "Oh, did you get a photo of this kid?" So this kid, I mean, he had passed away maybe 5, 6 years ago by this point. And then I did have the photo, which they clearly wanted so badly. And the grief, the moment they saw it was just so profound. I mean, it's exactly as you'd expect. Parents seeing a picture of their child who's died, and they haven't seen a picture of or anything for 5, 6 years. And then another case, which perhaps is really pertinent here because it's not even a child who one has had a substantial amount of time with. There was this one lady, and she had lost two of her kids within a week of them being born. And then when she was pregnant, and then you could tell, I mean, she was clearly, her mood was very low and she was clearly very anxious. And the baby, when she did have the baby, um, I don't know what the issue was, to be honest. But again, three days later, the baby became very sick. And, in one sense, if you're going to follow that logic of she should be used to it. But all these cases I've seen, I can't help but just feel like you can never get used to that. It's one of those things. I'm always remarkably surprised by how the human brain keeps adjusting its benchmarks of what changes mood. But I think that is so profound and so fundamental. We can't get used to that. But yeah, perhaps I'm also speculating. It's very hard to determine the degree.
Yeah, at least if there is some getting used to it, it's such a massive emotion that
Yeah.
it doesn't look much.
Yeah, exactly.
It doesn't look mild after that. But what about infanticide? Because I think it's something that, according to many data points that I found when I basically just Googled hunter-gatherer infanticide, I saw relatively high rates. I mean, I think it's very speculative. Everybody says we don't really know, but I saw something like 20% somewhere. I think it's important to remember that, first of all, these are communities without abortion. And so I think one sympathetic theory is that this is just their form of abortion. There is this fascinating work on infanticide by Sarah Hardy around how it's actually something that is quite unique in apes. Other apes don't seem to do it. And when you look at around the animal kingdom who does do infanticide in mammals, it tends to be those that have this human style alloparenting structure where you expect a lot of help to the parents. And so and then her theory is that infanticide really happens when you don't have that social support. So there's a lot of interesting things and I don't want to pretend like I can just come and say, look, infanticide is horrible. How can they ever do this? But it is still a question mark. If given that these feelings of grief seem to be so relatable for us, and infanticide is something that feels quite unrelatable to many of us here in the West. First of all, do you see it yourself when you're there? And secondly, what are your more general thoughts around it?
Yeah, so many things in what you said. There's so many things that came to mind. First thing I'll say is I haven't ever seen it or heard about it. I don't think it happens in the communities I work with. I know in the Aceh, there have been lots of reports of it, and it would typically happen if a child didn't have a father around. So if there wasn't going to be paternal investment, the community, I think it wasn't a maternal decision as such, but more of a norm and perhaps community enforced. But I don't want to, don't quote me on that because I'm not.
Yeah. By the way, I do want to say, actually, I think it's super important what you said, because I kind of misframed. I didn't frame Sarah Hardy correctly. Infanticide happens a lot in chimpanzees, for example. It happens all the time. It does not happen from the will of the mother. I think that's what she was highlighting, is that why is it that it happened, that the most likely killer in most human societies is the mother. And her theory is that it's because human mothers biologically expect social support to be able to do the work, or the hard work of parenting. And if they don't have it, it's just overwhelming and it's too much. So it's super important to make the distinction that I didn't make between infanticide being done by the mother, but versus the community.
Yeah, the other thing I was just going to mention, when you mentioned that that point about, it's so universal, one would think that this would cause grief, but on the other hand, we see infanticide. There are also these interesting beliefs you see, a variation you see across cultures in how they conceive of when a person becomes a person. You know, you could take some religious cultures and they say from the moment of conception, this is human and abortion is wrong. And then in some cultures, there's this idea that, it's not until the child is named that they're actually,
I see. And so the infanticide happens before.
I wonder if these are sort of cultural innovations to help deal with this. And you're not personalizing the individual in the same way.
Fascinating. Yeah. You know, my two main main interests in life at the moment is, one is understanding the past, which for me is mostly human evolution, but also other aspects of kind of big history. Another one is mental health, happiness, flourishing, whatever you want to call it. I think this is one of the first times doing the podcast that these have really come together. So thank you so much for it.
No worries, no worries.
We have, before we finish, if you don't mind, we have to address the one pinned issue, which is whether modern day hunter-gatherers are any use in understanding the past. Do you have stamina still for a little?
Yeah, I can try. I think, we have to have caveats. So, as I say, right now, I've even seen large ships. I first went to Congo just over a decade ago, and I haven't been for a few years, but even over the course of those 7 years, let's say, between my last trip and first trip, substantial changes. But even on the first trip, we can't have this vision that the communities we're working with are solely reliant on hunting and gathering. So that's one thing we need to bear in mind, which already creates a distinction between how they're living and how we were living prior to the Neolithic Revolution 10 to 12,000 years ago. Then some people would say, contemporary hunter-gatherers have all been sort of forced into marginal areas, and therefore they're living, there's a lot more harshness and resource scarcity and difficulties they're facing, and that's going to have all sorts of knock-on effects for how society functions, compared to in the past where population densities were low and they could live in richer habitats. I don't think the empirical data really supports that. Well, I think one well-established study of that was Frank Marlowe, who worked with the Hadza for a long time, but he actually did an analysis of product, sort of biomass and productivity rates in certain environments, and found that actually, if you compare immediate return hunter-gatherers living in warm climates, so we're not talking about Arctic hunter-gatherers here, which of course is a very harsh environment, they weren't in low productivity habitats.
Okay, because farmers want different, and they don't want the savanna, but a savanna is actually a very good environment for hunter-gatherers. Is that kind of the intuition?
Well, I mean, hunter-gatherers live in all, you've got savanna hunter-gatherers, coastal.
But just as an example, I mean, the it's not that they compete for exactly the same patch of land. The agriculturalists win and push them away somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. What makes a good farming environment doesn't necessarily make a good hunting and gathering environment. So I'm not too worried about that criticism. Not that I'm an expert on it. Some integration, of course, more trade the Bayaka will trade forest products for carbohydrates, and that's going to have big effects because once you've got more stable carbohydrates, there's less risk in the diet. But then trade as well, we can find places where trade is happening.
And alcohol, right?
Oh yeah, alcohol is a real problem in many hunter-gatherers around the world. Alcoholism is. I'm very curious about that. Why that seems to be a similar phenomenon in hunter-gatherers around the world.
By the way, is it a new problem? Is it a new problem? Do they get the alcohol from this kind of small trade, or do they produce it themselves?
They do produce some themselves, but also, there's also something to say about trade. So when I mentioned the Bayaka are trading with neighboring Bantu farming populations, this isn't something really new over the last 20 years. That sort of trade has been going on for hundreds, some people even say more than 1,000 years. So that is less of a recent globalization phenomenon. But then you've got these other phenomena which are emerging. You've got some places where even you can take a tourism tour and go on a foraging trip.
I've seen YouTube videos. There's some pretty fun ones.
Yeah. So you've got all these changes, but in my mind, that does not detract from the fact that they are probably, contemporary hunter-gatherers are probably more informative about our evolutionary history than any other human societies. Because I think if you look at social structures, generally across the animal kingdom, let's take primates, non-human primates, our closest relatives, you can map so much about their behavior, their social structure, their life history based on their diet and how they gather resources and what sort of resources, how those resources are distributed in space, and also their hierarchy. Of course, the structure of their hierarchies has such a profound effect on how the society functions and behavior. So
and the hierarchy patterns in hunter-gatherers, mobile hunter-gatherers, immediate return hunter-gatherers is just strikingly similar right across the globe.
Yeah.
Egalitarianism. Yeah.
So that's one of those things. When you start seeing these similarities, I think that's really testament to the fact that certain subsistence modes seem to result in certain behavioral, cultural, and social phenomena. And actually, when we look across subsistence modes generally, I always say to my students, if I had to pick one thing that you could use to predict various societal phenomenon, cultural phenomenon, behavioral phenomenon, social organization, it's not everything, but I'd pick subsistence. It's the one, if I had to pick one.
There was a German philosopher in the 1800s who agreed with you. Karl Marx.
So, yeah. And in that sense, of course, there are many differences between how hunter-gatherers are living now and then how populations were living before the Neolithic. But I think subsistence is a huge driver. I think the fact that you can see some similarities across hunter-gatherers living very far apart is indicative that there are certain outcomes which are intrinsically and inherently tied to a reliance on hunting and gathering. It's so amazing to me that you can have hunter-gatherers who don't have recent shared ancestry at all, are living on different continents and see very unique cultural, or what you'd imagine to be unique cultural phenomenon to seemingly arise in both via what you could call convergent cultural evolution. So where I work, a hunter might come back and you mustn't show off. So he comes back, might silently put the food down, or he might say, "Oh, I'm such a terrible hunter. There were so many animals in the forest state. If anyone else had gone out, they would have got so much more food." And then you see similar things amongst the actor from the Philippines.
And is the theory that trying to be a big guy, trying to get on top of a hierarchy is just very, very much frowned upon due to this egalitarian ethos?
Yes. I mean, the reason that works, I think, is that if you do try to get to the top of the hierarchy, people aren't going to take it. And if you're reliant on other people, then you're in trouble. So you have to abide by this sort of enforced modesty and not trying to be a big man. Because if you don't abide, then people are going to ostracize you. And if you're ostracized, then you're in real trouble.
Which is very interesting is, by the way, before we started, we were talking about Richard Wrangham off the record. And Wrangham makes a very big deal out of this because, the very long story, to put it very short, is that you take a Neanderthal skull and you take a Homo sapien skull and you try to judge which one is which, or an ancestral, say, Homo heidelbergensis skull, and you compare it to a sapien skull. The sapien skull looks like a dog skull looks compared to a wolf skull,
right.
is his way of putting it. Right. How could this have happened? Well, there is a theory that it happens with the same process as you get dogs out of wolves, which is that you select against the most aggressive or impulsively reactively aggressive individuals. Well, how could that have happened? This is how it could have happened. Wrangham says it happens because for some reason in our ancestors, people who were, like, especially these aggressive males who tried to get to the top of a hierarchy, were ostracized. And so there was selection against that. Now, it's a very, there's a lot of caveats to that story, but it is a very interesting one.
Yeah, for sure.
I don't know what you think about it.
Yeah, I think, as you say, there's lots of caveats there. And I can't say I'm an expert on, he calls it self-domestication. But I guess one could debate to what degree is it people are suppressing their desire for high status domination, or has there been active selection against those traits and those drives in the first place? And I guess my sense is that when you put humans in a situation where they can form hierarchies and they're not completely reliant on others, they do seem to have these drives for high status. They can be aggressive. And yeah, I think it's very much a matter of hugely driven by ecological context and socio-ecological context. That's not to say clearly our capacity for cooperating and not forming hierarchies, it is quite amazing.
I have one final question that I ask each guest, which is, how has all the research that you've done shaped your outlook on humanity?
Oh, that's super interesting. One aspect is a recognition that we are just this response to socio-ecology, that individuals and cultures are these flexible outcomes of certain environmental contexts and the subsistence they rely on. And that then has all sorts of implications for how I think about free will, but also morals. And I think it just takes away agency to some degree, takes away this sense that we have an essence, very much in sort of almost Taoist perspective of we're just something the universe is doing. We're just a happening.
I think Alan Watts wrote that just as the ocean waves, the universe peoples.
Exactly that. And that has changed my view of humanity, I guess. I stopped thinking of people and humans as entities doing stuff. I just see the universe peopling.
Dr. Nikhil Chaudhary, thank you so much for your time today and really inspiring research.
Thank you very much for having me. It was really lovely to talk to you.
So that was it for today. Thanks for listening until the very end. If you like this conversation and want to learn more about the life ways of hunter-gatherers and what they can tell us about the past, have a look at episode 14 with Vivek Venkatraman. You can also dig deeper and get more analysis, etc. to your inbox by subscribing to the On Humans newsletter at onhumans.substack.com. But then if On Humans is something that gives you valuable learning, you can give something back. The easiest thing to do is just to subscribe, give a nice review, and share it with a friend. You can also become a paying member at patreon.com/onhumans. Thank you as always for listening. Until next time, take care.